Hello again, it's Matt here from Christ the Rock. It's great to be able to share with you once more as we continue working through the book of Exodus. Before we get into today's passage, I just want to say that as we read these words, I want to be looking at them through the lens of a question. And the question is this: how do we live today when we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring? And I think today's passage is really important for us as a community for all kinds of reasons, but primarily because I think we, in a sense, find ourselves in a similar place to the Israelites. You see, the Israelites, they had this promise from God of a future in the promised land. There was a place they were heading to where God had promised them they were going to experience enormous blessing, but they weren't there yet. And actually, even though we can look at this as a text in hindsight and see God's faithfulness to them, ultimately, I imagine for a lot of them at that moment, they felt quite uncertain perhaps and even doubtful of what the future might hold. And for us as a community, you know, we should and can draw confidence for the future in the same way that God has been with us in the past. In the same way he's with us now, so we can draw confidence from the fact that he will be with us as we look forwards. And yet, very clearly, what that will look like, the shape of our lives individually, the shape even of our church, the shape of our wider community in terms of how we function as a society, could very well look different in the months, years ahead than it does today. And so the question for the Israelites at that moment, and I think the question for us, is this: how do we live today when we don't know what tomorrow will bring? So we're going to read just a few verses from chapter 19. We're picking up from where Jason led us last week. So the Israelites are in the wilderness. They've seen God provide food and water for them. And then we read these words at the beginning of Exodus 19. So the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud, so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you." Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people." And as we read these few words, I think there are two key messages God has for Moses. The first is that in a few days, in the future, I'm going to come to you in a wonderful and miraculous way. And indeed, chapter 20 of Exodus, which we'll get to next week, God meets Moses on Mount Sinai and gives him the Ten Commandments, the beginning of the Old Testament law. This amazing, miraculous moment for the Israelite people. So he says, on the one hand, there is a time coming where I'm going to be with you in a wonderful way. But today, consecrate yourselves to me. Go to the people and consecrate them today. And it's this second part that I just want to spend the next 5 or so minutes exploring. That word consecrate. What does it mean to be a people consecrated for God? This word consecrate is a word of enormous importance. In the book of Exodus, it appears 19 times, but across the whole Bible, it is this prevailing theme, both describing God but also describing what he wants for his people. And the meaning of this word consecrate is, the Hebrew word is the word kadesh, but its literal meaning is set apart. To put something to one side is the meaning of the word. And we might typically also understand it as the word holy. Some of you might remember in 1 Peter, where Peter says to them, he quotes Leviticus, he says, God calls us to be holy as he is holy. In a sense, set yourselves apart in the same way I am set apart. We see it at the beginning, right at the beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, where we have the creation story, where we have the first 6 days of creation, where God works in this marvelous way to bring about the creation of the universe. But the 7th day, he says, that day is to be holy. It is to be set apart, because on that day he rested from the work he'd done. And indeed, for the Jewish people, for us as Christians, we still have that practice, or many of us do, of seeing one day of the week as being truly set apart for God. Indeed, across the book of Exodus, we see multiple times where we get Moses being called to consecrate, to set apart people and things for the purposes of God. And indeed, when we get to Joshua, just before the Israelites enter into the promised land, in Joshua 3, I think, Joshua says to the people, consecrate yourselves, set yourselves apart, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. Consecrate yourselves. What does it mean for us as an individual? What does it mean for our families? What does it mean for our community to be people who are consecrated, who are set apart for the things of God? And before we get to what that should look like, I want to just think briefly about what it shouldn't look like. As many of you all know, one of my spiritual superheroes is Tim Keller. I love Tim Keller. I kind of want to be him. Maybe that's why I shaved my head. And he writes about this idea of being consecrated or being holy. And he says that one of the mistaken assumptions we can make when reading the Old Testament in particular is we assume that to be holy, to be set apart for God as a person, implies a certain level of moral or ethical living. In a sense, you might look at the Old Testament law and say, like the Ten Commandments, if you live up to that level, then you'll be holy or classified as holy. And yet, and whilst there is truth in that, Tim Keller's point is that is only a slither, in a sense, of what this term really means. And primarily, one of the most obvious reasons for that is because the term consecrate or holy isn't just used for people, it's also used for lots of other things. So for example, in Exodus and Leviticus, we read about consecrated pots and consecrated tables and consecrated rams. And so it's not just people who are to be consecrated, but actually things and animals can be consecrated for the purposes of God as well. And so for Tim, he says that to say something is consecrated, it cannot just mean it lives up to a certain level of ethics or morality, because the table in the temple doesn't live to a higher ethical code than my kitchen table here, does it? What it actually means is that the purpose and the belonging of that table is found in God. And so for us as individuals, for us as a community, what it means to be consecrated is to look at ourselves, to look at our families, to look at our churches and say, we are set apart for you. We belong, God, to you. Tim summarizes it like this. He says, a holy person is someone who says, I belong to you. God, I am set apart for you. And the reason I think this is so important for us is because we don't know what tomorrow necessarily will bring. And I guess the temptation when we face these kind of moments in history is to think very practically, to think what should we do, to think where should we meet, to think what career choice should I make, or where should I live, or how should I kind of do different things in my finances to make sure I'm safe for tomorrow. And yet actually perhaps God's question for us now isn't necessarily what are you doing, but more whose are you? Are you mine still? When the future is uncertain, when we don't know what tomorrow will bring, are we still his? And I imagine, for most of us, including myself, this is quite a difficult question, because when it comes to that more practical, real life element of our faith, when it comes to thinking about our finances, thinking about our jobs, thinking about our relationships, thinking about our families, it's very, very straightforward to think we want to keep control over those things. A very, I think, sympathetic question would be, why would I want to give control of that to someone else? Why would I want to set apart my family or my bank balance or my pension fund for the things of God when I don't know what tomorrow is going to look like? And I wonder if this might be perhaps a useful way of thinking of it. On August 27th, 2014, I was an unmarried man. And I, in a sense, had a lot of control over my future. I had control over my finances. I had control over where I worked, control over where I lived. I had a lot of control and freedom in my life. But then on August 28th, I got down on one knee next to a big Great Lake in the Quebec region of Canada. And in front of Sophie, I pulled out a ring and I said, "Sophie, will you marry me?" And she said yes. And in a sense, in that one moment, even though it was just one question and one answer, the whole trajectory of my life changed. All of a sudden, my finances, my future holiday plans, my career decisions, all that kind of stuff went from being under my control, in a sense, to being under someone else's control. And I wonder, if someone was to ask me at that moment, why did you do that, Matt? Why did you ask this woman to marry you when you're going to lose all this control? I probably could have given two answers. The first is I might have said, well, what I did is I weighed it all up, and I weighed up the economic and the social benefits of being married, and I decided that was worth, losing some of the freedoms. And sometimes I think there's a danger that we might even define Christianity in these ways. That we think, well, the reason I've become a Christian is because I sat down and I logically, reasonably worked it all out and decided, yes, there must be a God. Jesus really did die, and so, I might as well live for him. And yet, actually, that's not the reason any of us hopefully get married to someone. The reason we want to give control over all the stuff we care about to someone else is because we trust them, because we love them, because we want to share our holidays with them. We want to share the rest of our lives with them. And so when it comes to us as individuals setting ourselves apart for God, why do we do it? Well, we do it because of who he is. At the end of Exodus, or near the end, in Exodus 34, Exodus begins in chapter 1 with the Israelites under the oppression of Pharaoh, but it ends with them under the rule of God. And God describes himself for the first time in this wonderful way with these truly incredible words. He says, "I am the Lord. I am compassionate and gracious. I'm slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. I maintain loves to thousands. I forgive wickedness, rebellion, and sin." This sense of they started the story under the oppression of Pharaoh, and yet they end it under the wonderful rule of God. And that's what God wants, I think, for us. This wonderful, compassionate, gracious God wants us to share and give control and set apart our lives for him. And I think this changes a lot of typically quite mundane Christian stuff. If you think about, say, our time, why do we read why are we called as Christians to read the Bible and pray? Is it because we want to kind of tick some spiritual, God box so that he'll like us more? Or is it because we want to draw close to this wonderful God who wants to know us and bless us? Why do we give financially? Why do we live in a way that's different to perhaps how the rest of the world would live? Why, when tomorrow we're not sure of, are we still seeking to be generous with our finances? Is it because we want God to, kind of like us and tick the God box? Or is it because we care about the things God cares about? And we recognize that actually his call for his kingdom, his call to support and encourage the oppressed, the poor, the broken, is perhaps more important than some of our concerns. And then lastly, if we think about our future, if we think about our decisions, these probably quite tough choices many of us are going to have to face. Are we begrudgingly asking God for direction? Are we begrudgingly asking God to just kind of tick off our life decisions because we've asked him enough times? Or are we coming to God and saying, God, I know that you know what's best. And so I give you these things. I set them apart for you. And I trust you to have your way with my life, whatever the future looks like. John Wesley, the leader of early Methodism, one of the early fighters against slavery, said these words. He said, I continue to dream and to pray about a revival of holiness. He prays for a revival of people who will set apart their lives for him. And I'm going to pray that for us. So, Father, we don't know necessarily what tomorrow will bring. We don't know what our lives, our church's life, or even this country will look like in the months and years ahead. But whatever we face, we trust you with the things we have. And Lord, we pray that you would give us the courage to set apart the things that matter most to the things that matter most to you. Amen. Bless you, everyone, and I'll see you again.